The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Amy Fried, author of At War with Government, How Conservatives Weaponized Distrust from Goldwater to Trump. Gaby Goldstein on why building a progressive future begins with state legislatures. Plus, Bill Press with Adam Schiff on his new book, Midnight in Washington, How We Almost Lost Our Democracy and Still Could. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Polling shows that Americans' trust in government sits near a historic low. In her newest book, Amy Fried reveals that this is no accident, but rather a conservative political strategy that goes back decades. And we say hello to Amy Fried, political science professor at the University of Maine. Her most recent book, co-written with Douglas Harris, At War with Government, How Conservatives Weaponized Distrust from Goldwater to Trump. Amy Fried, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
It's really great to be here.
And our pleasure to have you with us. You know, this is a powerful phrase you have in your title, weaponized distrust. So let's start there. What does that mean?
Well, what it means is taking something that has really, really deep roots in American political history, which is a certain amount of skepticism and distrust of government, and then turning it into a political weapon. And the book looks at that in two different ways. One is over time, historically, so going through different periods of time with, really the greatest emphasis on the last 50 years or a little bit even further back. But then also we make this general case that distrust is used in four different ways specifically. So it's used to try to win elections by making certain appeals as part of your political campaigns. It's also used to help organizations, whether that's a political party or some other political organization. At one point, we describe it as the glue that holds together the conservative coalition or the Republican coalition. It's helping to build and maintain organizations. It's also used in institutional combat. Think of, let's say, the Congress versus the president at various points, where there are arguments that one institution doesn't deserve trust. And so it's being used to shift power away from those towards the institutions that are controlled by conservatives. And then finally, in terms of policy, so promoting certain policies is really frightening and worthy of distrust. You see this a lot in healthcare, whether it's right now with COVID rules, public health measures, but really anytime anyone has tried to improve health coverage, starting with Harry Truman. It's socialist, it's big government, it's frightening. So it's used in those policy ways as well.
Now, your book, as indicated in the title, goes back to the Goldwater campaign to trace how distrust has become a powerful force in politics. What shifted back then?
Well, let's look at that even in a little bit slightly early political context. So what was going on before that? Well, if you go back, obviously 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt's administration, there was the Depression, there was the development of all of these big programs to bring the country back. Also the establishment of Social Security, unemployment insurance, lots of regulation of financial institutions. And then the federal government continued to grow and do more things as part of the fight in World War II. And so between the Depression, New Deal, World War II, and the immediate post-war period where the Republican president Eisenhower was building, let's say, the interstate highway system, you had very high levels of trust in government. So what's going on with Goldwater then? What happens? He runs for president in 1964. It's also a period of the Cold War. So there's some of that kind of distrust towards Democrats. You saw that in the 1950s with McCarthyism, particularly against Democrats, sometimes not, but mostly against that. But you also have this rise of the civil rights movement. And Johnson becomes a great proponent of major civil rights legislation, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and also introducing new programs that are, that some of which, have stuck around today and are very important, like Medicare and Medicaid. So Goldwater was very much opposed to Johnson's policies, both Medicare, Medicaid, and he was also against the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And this was a bit of a break between him and the people who are the Republican establishment of the day. There really was a fair amount of support from Republicans for civil rights legislation at the time and voting rights, and mixed views about things like Medicare and Medicaid. So you really see this very strong anti-government turn at that point that's associated with civil rights, issues around race, and then certain domestic policies. And there's the rise of these conspiracy-minded groups that become associated with the Republican Party. So there's a plank introduced at the Republican National Convention in 1964, denouncing the John Birch Society, which is this, sort of like conspiratorial one world government, like, think of QAnon or something today, maybe not quite that bad, but that sort of thing. And as I said, this plank is introduced, but it gets voted down by people at the convention. So there's that element there, that sort of conspiratorial element. This is kind of Reagan's big entree into party politics. He gives this big speech warning about Americans' freedoms being taken away. And so what happens in 1964 ultimately is kind of the rise of this part among Republicans. And Goldwater does very poorly in 1964, but he does it in a way that has like really big implications for what's to come, because he wins 5 deep South states and Arizona. That's all he wins. It's a landslide for Johnson, but it really starts to pull the South, which is, basically the white voting South, because Black people don't have the right to vote in many Southern states in a real way, over towards the Republican Party. And this is something that just totally blows people away when they hear it a lot of times if they don't know it. 1964 is the last time a Democrat wins the white vote in the presidential race. Johnson is the last time in 1964, because this whole, sort of Southern push gets taken up by Richard Nixon and then by Reagan, and it's with us today. Where you look at the Electoral College maps now, most of this, the South tends to be heavily Republican in presidential races.
Right. Yeah. And all of those extremely conservative Democrats that said, hey, that's enough of this party, I'm out of here. Another turning point you identify is within the Clinton administration, and you specifically call out Newt Gingrich. What was his role in weaponizing distrust?
Well, Gingrich was really a master strategist, and he was a coalition builder, and he went after 2 main targets. One were the GOP leaders in Congress who had been interested in compromise and interested in governing. So he pushes out some of those people and really organizes in order to have this, more far-right, hard-edge group take over. But that is, also against the second target is more, which is to do that in order to take power from Democrats. And he creates these sort of faux political scandals. People who are around from those days may remember people talking about the House Bank and the House Post Office, which really were not much of anything at all. But he creates these kind of scandals. He gets all of these people, young Republicans, to give these speeches that C-SPAN is going to pick up to an empty chamber, starting, and you have really the rise of talk radio at the time, right-wing talk radio. And he really works with those folks. And then he creates all of these trainings to get people to, quote, talk like Newt, which is just blasting Democrats, not just disagreement, but calling them evil, calling them corrupt, anti-family, just this whole set of words. And then works with people like Frank Luntz, who put together the Contract with America to run on in order to take over the House. He was also very much a part of the effort to bring down Clinton's health reform proposal, and then to go after Clinton for the Lewinsky scandal, although comes out later, he himself was having an affair at the time. And in fact, he had to resign after the 1998 election when the Republicans lost seats in the House, because it wasn't a good strategy over all these kinds of attacks. Most Americans didn't want to impeach Bill Clinton, but it did bring together the Republicans. And he was really very much a strategist in bringing this along, bringing different groups together, and in some ways just with a completely shameless individual. Like when I mentioned this one part of how distrust was used with institutions, he goes from blasting the idea that Congress should even have very much power, saying Congress had gotten completely out of control. The founding fathers did not believe that Congress should have so much power. So as soon as he gets to be Speaker of the House, he starts arguing, no, the founders really believe Congress should be the most powerful branch. That's why it's Article 1 in the Constitution. So he's, completely shameless, and he uses just really, I don't know, just outrageous language as part of it, but he's also very strategic. So even though he's using that kind of wild language at times, he's doing it in a way that's he's focused on how he wants it to have an impact.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking to Amy Fried, political science professor at the University of Maine. Her most recent book, co-written with Douglas Harris, At War with Government, How Conservatives Weaponized Distrust, from Goldwater to Trump. Amy, is it accurate to say that this kind of strategy is uniquely Republican? And if so, why would that be the case?
Well, I think in the current incarnation, it definitely is more Republican. And I, certainly everyone should have a certain amount of skepticism in government. There's all kinds of things we could look at and say, this shouldn't have happened. You think of all that came out about CIA involvement in coups, over the years. So there are a lot of different things that are worth really, a skeptical eye towards. On the other hand, when it comes to anything to do with, accomplishing things in terms of like regulating private power, whether it has to do with pollution or development, that sort of thing, or programs on healthcare, other sorts of things to help people, childcare, that is where Republicans have just really come in and tried to promote distrust in government. And there's been this libertarian streak that has tended to dominate now, in part because of the impact of some very deep-pocketed donors like the Koch brothers, but others who have really created this kind of right-wing donor network and built their own sort of right-wing institutions like the Federalist Society. And so, if you don't want government to do very much, then it's a very good strategy to promote distrust in government. So libertarianism and distrust in government tend to go along. So if you look at someone like a Mitch McConnell, what does he really want? All he really wants is to have more tax cuts, appoint more right-wing judges, and try to have government do less. So, that's where you really can benefit if you promote distrust government, if you don't want government really to do much of anything.
Bringing the story forward to today, it would seem like distrust in government has taken a whole new life with Donald Trump. How do you describe the impact of Trump in this narrative?
Well, Trump is a continuation of it. There's some people have these discussions about, is Trump something completely new? We say, no, he's not completely new. He's a continuation of this longer pattern that Doug Harris and I have looked at. On the other hand, he is somewhat new. It's more extreme, the way that he uses language and even his approach to government. So, you look at his very xenophobic language, more overtly racialized or racist kind of language that people in the past, maybe were more careful in how they talked about those sorts of things from the people who were running for office, who were Republicans or Republican presidents. And then it's just really applied much more broadly, like the attempts to really delegitimize elections that we've seen. Trump has done that all along. He did that even when he was in primaries in 2016 against fellow Republicans. So he's just taken all of this to, just really new heights or new lows, depending on how you see it.
Right. Yeah. I think it works both ways. Now, and you mentioned this a second ago, mistrust of government can be a healthy thing and lead to good outcomes. But how do you know when it's gone too far, and what's the price we pay when that happens?
Well, I think it goes too far when people really cannot address serious problems and can't work together to address them, and can't really even acknowledge certain realities. So we see all these polls in the last 9-10 months to do with the election, the 2020 election, where Republicans do not even, most Republicans don't accept that it was a fair election and that Biden was legitimately elected. Even polling on January 6th, there's some really striking kinds of findings, with a lot of Republicans not believing that it really was Trump supporters who were there. That's someone else was invading the Capitol, and then also in terms of reactions to COVID and some of the views about vaccines. So, when you are not acknowledging reality, where we end up really harming ourselves and harming our democracy. And for Republicans who still may be very conservative, like a Liz Cheney, who wants to at least acknowledge a certain amount of reality, she may be in, pretty serious political trouble. So you end up with a party that's really spiraling more and more towards this lack of acceptance of what's going on, because people would rather trust Trump or some YouTube videos over the CDC and Dr. Fauci.
You mentioned Liz Cheney. I mean, it's amazing to think that a person as conservative as she is now being vilified by her own party for believing in reality. It doesn't make any sense. Now, your book offers strategies to rebuild trust in government. So where do we begin?
Yeah, I think that there are some things that we could do, starting with, like acknowledging what has happened, but then what do we do from there? And we really did try to look at what there is research about to support some particular strategies for change. And one of the things that's been known for a really long time by political scientists, going back to the 1970s, is that if you ask people about specific regulations or specific social programs, policies to help people, they like those. They like things to help make the air clean and have safe drinking water, say. People love Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, those sorts of things, lots of other things like that. But if you ask them, what do you think of government, or what do you think of regulations, or, they don't like that. So there's this difference between the specific and the general. So one thing that we argue is that we should be highlighting those specifics more, but also trying to make this broader argument about government that hasn't been made for a long time. If you go back to Franklin Roosevelt, he did make those arguments. He talked about how government promoted opportunity. Even Lyndon Johnson did to some extent, and really promote freedom. We're freer if we are able to get a hold of this pandemic, right? We're freer if we can have certain things taken care of that we don't have to worry about, that we can't afford health care. So making that bigger argument, but also promoting those sorts of specifics, that's one thing. Another is to really think about political campaigns and campaigning in ways that connect with people's experiences, making sure that we're talking to people more door to door. There are a lot of groups that are trying to do more of what's called deep canvassing, where you talk to people about their experiences and connect with them. That can make some difference. Making sure that candidates are people that everyday Americans relate to, more working class candidates, people from working class backgrounds, women candidates, making sure that the local organizations, state and party organizations and local party organizations are more healthy and doing more things year round, not just during campaign season when you show up and ask someone to vote for you. And another thing I'd mention is just as policies are put into place, to make sure that they actually are well implemented and they're talked about as successes of government. Now, when something goes wrong, like the Obamacare exchanges, the computer system didn't work well, that's a bit of a blow. People say, look, we can't trust government. It doesn't know what it's doing. So trying to, maybe this seems obvious, but make sure you do things in a way that's you're doing it well, you don't underfund it, and you don't take a long time for programs to start after you pass them. There's some talk right now with the Build Back Better agenda that some things might get put off. So that's some people suggested, okay, well, we can pass extensions to Medicare, like add hearing and eyes and whatever other sorts of things, but maybe not do it for a few years. No, get it started as soon as possible. Then people will recognize this is what's happened and it makes a difference. So doing a good job in carrying out policies, campaigning in ways that connect to people, making the big arguments about government while also touting the specific programs that people like. Those would be some of the things that could make a difference.
Anything at this point, I think, would be a positive in that regard. So hopefully we can start heading down that road sooner rather than later. The name of the book, again, At War with Government, How Conservatives Weaponized Distrust, From Goldwater to Trump. Amy Fried, co-written with Douglas Harris, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Amy, we really appreciate your time with us today. Would love to have you back again soon.
Absolutely. It was great to be here.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing or one time in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, a project to help progressive Democrats get elected to state legislatures. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
What is so supreme about the Supreme Court? I mean, besides being housed in an imposing marble building, being the final stop on America's judicial train, and having its 9 members look photogenically authoritarian in those full-body black robes. And yes, its existence is written into the Constitution, but so is Congress, and no one thinks of it as anything supreme. We 330 million Americans are told we must obey the law as defined by a half-dozen unelected lawyers on this court. Why should we democratic citizens do that? After all, these legalistic elites have no actual power to force their personal beliefs on us. There's no Supreme Court army. In fact, their sole source of power is one that is intangible, extremely fragile, and easily frittered away: public trust. We should go along with their rulings only if they appear to be fair and honest, not based on personal whim or partisan ideology, and not meant to extend plutocratic power over the people. As Justice Elena Kagan rightly put it, the only way we can get people to do what we think they should do is because people respect us. That's where the present majority of far right-wing appointees have failed so abjectly. Rather than meeting a lofty standard of judiciousness, all 6 have pulled the court down into the mire of crass Republican politics. They've corrupted the system and jiggered the law to decree that corporate campaign cash is free speech, that the state can take over women's bodies, that the Republican Party can unilaterally shut millions of voters out of America's voting booths, and so awful much more that enthrones the few over the many. This is Jim Hightower saying, respect? Trust? The Republican court is already down to 40% public approval rating, having surrendered its legitimacy to be a governing authority over us. Howdy-ho, folks. Thanks for tuning in and sharing my weekly commentaries. Also, please join me for a live web show I host every other Tuesday, the Hightower Lowdown Happy Hour at the Chat and Chew Cafe. You can join the action live online as I chat with grassroots leaders and progressive sparklies from around the country. Go to hightowerlowdown.org/chat-and-chew to find out about upcoming guests and watch past episodes. That's hightowerlowdown.org/chat-and-chew.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Republicans have made the control of state legislatures a priority, and it's working. Gaby Goldstein says it's time for Democrats to catch up, and that's why she co-founded a project to help them do just that. And we say hello to Gaby Goldstein, co-founder at Sister District, whose mission is to build progressive power in state legislatures. Gaby Goldstein, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Hey, Jim. Thanks so much for having me.
Our pleasure to have you with us. Sister District started after the 2016 election to help get progressive Democrats get elected to state legislatures. What makes state legislatures such a critical political arena right now?
Yes. So my co-founders and I started the organization, as you said, after the 2016 election, which both feels like yesterday and not nearly long enough ago, because we saw a gap in organizing capacity and resources going specifically to progressive Dems running at running at this level of the ballot for state legislature. And, these are races that historically kind of toil in obscurity, not headline grabbers for the most part. And we really saw a gap there. I like to say, well, I hate to say that Dems are tardy to the party when it comes to paying attention to state legislatures. Republicans have just been absolutely masterful at this for years, decades, really weaponizing state legislatures for their own regressive policy goals. But we really saw these as critically important, overlooked venues of power for Democrats. These are our leadership pipelines. Half of all presidents and members of Congress started in their state legislature. These are our policy pipelines. State legislative policy really gets around and often becomes the basis of federal policy. And then, of course, state legislatures are a vital key to fair districts and voting rights. Gerrymandering and voter suppression are creatures of state law for the most part. And so, and 5 years later, this work is more important than ever, with all of the incredible voter suppression bills, the volume of voter suppression bills coming out of Republican-controlled states, redistricting underway with gerrymandering, sprinting to gerrymander in places like Ohio and Texas, and the types of democracy subversion that we're seeing come out of our state legislatures. It is still critically important that we focus on this level of the ballot.
Yeah, in fact, those last couple of things out of control in terms of the gerrymandering, although, there are those independent commissions that some states have developed to try and curb that a bit. But the voter restrictions, I cringe. But anyway, in terms of state legislatures that are, say, already blue, how do you decide where to focus your efforts and which candidates to support?
Yeah, so our political strategy is generally the same year to year. We're always looking for state legislative chambers that we think could flip blue in any given year. We're looking for chambers that, so we call those blue flips. We're looking for state legislative chambers that are blue, but that are really fragile, where we could lose that majority. So we call those blue holds. And then we're always looking for what we call blue inroads, which are states where we don't have a one-cycle solution to flip the legislature, but we have to make progress. We have to push towards that. And so, I think Virginia is a great example of that sort of longer-term strategy. When we first started working in Virginia to try to help flip the legislature blue back in 2017, the House of Delegates, which is their lower chamber, was, double digits down. Democrats were double digits down, 17 seats, 16 seats, whatever it was. And it took two cycles. It took, the 2017 and then 2019 cycles to flip both of those chambers blue and deliver a beautiful blue trifecta in the state of Virginia. And so we were able to move those chambers from blue flip opportunities into what we have this year in Virginia, which is a blue hold situation. The lower chamber in Virginia is up this year, and it's very much a fragile chamber for Democrats. It's an all hands on deck situation to maintain this majority. It's very much in jeopardy. So that's the general strategy, is we're looking for those types of chambers. And then in terms of the specific candidates that we support in the chambers that we've identified as strategic, we're always looking for the majority makers. The seats that are the most fragile, if they're held by Democrats, and the seats that are most flippable towards Democrats. We're always looking to build a more representative democracy. So, we're always eager to support candidates who are women, who are BIPOC, LGBTQ folks, really building towards a reflective democracy in our states. So that's a little bit about the political strategy that goes into the chambers and the seats that we support.
And, Gaby, you mentioned Virginia, and that's one of those states that in recent years went from a true red state to what a lot of people consider a purple state. Your newest initiative is the Purple District Network, which supports progressive state legislatures in purple districts. As we approach 2022, how significant are purple districts in the overall progressive strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. So this initiative came out of a series of conversations that we had with candidates who were then elected and became elected officials over the years, really trying to understand where we could continue to be helpful. We had supported them when they were candidates. Okay, now you're elected. What can we do to help? Where are there still gaps? And one thing that we, came to see was that folks who were in red to blue flips and really fragile Democratic seats, their experiences are just a little bit different than folks in deep blue seats. And so we put this network together. We have about 60 members in 25 states so far. Next year, we're looking to double the network. And these are really critically important, often overlooked seats. Remember, these are the legislators that are the majority makers. These are the most fragile Democrats in their chambers. And so it's really important that we give them the skills, the resources, and frankly, the community, the network that they need to be effective and to thrive. So really excited about this initiative. It's the only legislator network in the country that supports purple district folks, those folks in what are called frontline seats, the seats that are on the chopping block, the most likely to flip back red. And so it's a really critical gap that we're filling with this new program.
How is it different helping, say, a progressive Democrat win in a purple district compared to a solid blue district?
Yeah, so these legislators are, a lot of the stuff's the same, right? Everybody wants progressive policies, but the contexts are slightly different. So, some folks in purple districts are in very polarized districts when it comes to partisans. So, think of more rural districts that might have a college in it or college town in an otherwise more rural area. Other folks are in more evenly distributed districts when it comes to partisans where people are kind of bunched up in the middle. But these folks are really at the front lines. They're called frontline legislators, and that means that they're really the most vulnerable members of their caucus. And so, some of the stuff that they need is different. So some of the sessions that we've been doing this year are focused on providing space to talk about governance, tips and strategies, building constituent services programs that are really innovative and effective, thinking about redistricting and how that may have implications for folks in these frontline districts, which are often, in Republican-controlled states. The Republican legislature will often try to draw these particular folks into districts together or eliminate their districts altogether. They're often really in danger during redistricting. And so, having those conversations and having a space to let these folks talk to each other and learn from each other. And also around re-election, which is just around the corner next year. Really what we're doing here is creating this space, keeping it small by design, and creating the space to have deeper relationship building and skills transfer among these legislators to make sure that they have what they need to be effective.
We're speaking to Gaby Goldstein, one of the co-founders at Sister District, whose mission is to build progressive power in state legislatures. And Gaby, I think it's important to point out that the work of Sister District goes beyond helping candidates get elected. You equip legislators with the skills and networks to create progressive policy. So tell us a bit about what goes into that work.
Yeah, I really think this is part of a long-term vision, right? And I think that it's something that's been sorely lacking, or at least underdeveloped on the left, which is having a longer term vision of what success means to us and what the world could look like if we instituted progressive policies everywhere. And part of that really goes into thinking longer than just one election cycle, right? 1 year or one presidential cycle. No, we need to be thinking in terms terms of decades. And part of that is to think about what makes legislators effective, how they can learn from each other, and also thinking about, and this is something I do, thinking about what the right does well. And something that the right does really well is first of all, know that state legislatures are extremely important, and work with state legislators directly on policy and governance and really give them a lot of resources. We don't do that as well on the left. In part, there's a lot of reasons why. That would be a whole other set of conversations. But there's a lot of opportunity for us to be more long-term, to be more strategic, and to think in terms of decades rather than in terms of election cycles. And so that's really gets to the heart of this type of legislator support, is really thinking about supporting these legislators for a long time and thinking about the progressive policies that we want to see in the world and finding ways to get there together so that we're building towards something that I think, we don't have enough of a narrative around, which is progressive federalism. We think of federalism and the idea of states' rights and these sorts of things is very conservative, right? We don't, progressives don't tend to think in those terms, but we really do need to. And one of the ways that we can build towards that progressive federalism future vision, where we have a safe and a fair and a just set of states, is by making sure that state legislators have what they need to be successful.
Well, and another aspect of your work is educating voters on the importance of state legislatures. And this one really gets me because that's the most important thing to me when I go to the polls. It's not necessarily the national election. It's those local elections, or more localized. How much of an uphill climb is that to get these voters educated on the importance of state legislatures?
Yeah, I mean, the good news is I think that folks have really, I think the public has woken up a lot in the past few years. A great friend of the organization, Dave Daly, wrote this great book about the 2011 redistricting cycle called RAT, FUCKED. Don't want to say it on the podcast, but great book that really went into how Republicans were able to take over so many state legislatures in the last redistricting cycle. And, this cycle is different because we have more public awareness. We have more infrastructure. We have more organizations on the ground fighting for fair districts and all the rest. So that's all to say. The good news is that I think that there's been more public awareness about state legislatures, particularly because of redistricting in the past few years. But there's still a very, very long way to go to get folks up to speed about how important these venues of power are, particularly for progressives. When we looked at the data after the 2020 election, which of course was the highest public salience election of our lifetime, we saw a pretty strong enthusiasm gap between Republicans and Democrats at the bottom of the ticket, right? And so Republicans had a lot more enthusiasm at the bottom of the ticket than we did, even though Joe Biden won the presidency. And so, this enthusiasm gap is really, really a problem for us on our side of the aisle, because we have to keep making the case. We have to show people why state legislatures voting all the way down to the bottom of the ballot, why it matters. And so that's an ongoing project that, that we're engaged in, and others that have kind of come up in this space around state legislatures. Again, I think it goes to this long-term goal, right? We need to have a long-term vision of why states matter and why they matter to people's lives.
I want to go back before we let you go. I want to go back to let's talk about voting rights and how they're under attack. And Republican-led state legislatures are passing these restrictive new laws. Now redistricting is in play, as you brought up. What are your biggest concerns on this front? And more importantly, how is Sister District engaged in protecting elections?
Yeah. So on the electoral side, I think the biggest, what keeps me up at night, what we have to fight against is complacency, a mission accomplished attitude because Joe Biden is the president right now. And, we have a very fragile trifecta in Washington. But I think that folks are tired, and, we've all put a lot in over the past several years. But it's absolutely critical that we keep fighting permanently. This is not, we have to consider the work that we all do in protecting our democracy, permanent feature of our lives. It's not going away. And so fighting that complacency, fighting that mission accomplished feeling, getting Democrats fired up, staying fired up on the electoral side, that I think is one of our biggest challenges. On the infrastructure side, I think it's a challenge that we're continuing to face is needing to invest in that long-term vision of the future, that long-term strategy that Republicans do so well. We need to do that. And so at Sister District, on the electoral side, we are fighting to keep this Democratic majority, this trifecta in Virginia this year. It's not too late, but we're running out of time. The election day is a month from today, and so we're really fighting there. And on the infrastructure side, it's all the programs that we've been talking about. Our legislator support programs, our civic engagement programs, making that long-term case. Our candidate recruitment and training programs that we didn't have a chance to talk about, building, really trying to build towards that reflective democracy by helping recruit and train women, people of color, LGBTQ folks, keep those folks in the pipeline and all the rest, because it's going to take all of that infrastructure stuff to really be able to execute a long-term plan.
Gaby Goldstein, co-founder at Sister District, their mission to build progressive power in state legislatures. Gaby, we really appreciate your time with us today. We really appreciate the work that you're doing. We'd love to have you back again soon and talk some more about it and talk more about the progress that you all will continue to make.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with Congressman Adam Schiff on why we can't ignore the crimes that happened on January 6th.
What should Merrick Garland do? What will he do?
Well, he should, in my view, promptly bring that before the grand jury. The statute provides the department has a duty to do so. That's a duty that's not always observed, but I think there's good reason to believe that that's exactly what will happen. The Biden administration repeatedly, including the Justice Department, has made it clear they're not going to assert executive privilege. They want the January 6th Select Committee to get all the information we need to write a comprehensive report, to write recommendations about protecting the country going forward, that January 6th was no ordinary day in the life of our country. And as the White House said once again in rejecting Trump's claims of executive privilege, the unquestioned public interest here is in disclosure. And so given that Bannon has no grounds to refuse and simply failed to show up, I think he'll be prosecuted and should be prosecuted.
Why is that so important?
It's important in two respects. First, he's a key witness. This was somebody on January 5th that was predicting that all hell was going to break loose on January 6th, as indeed it did. But more than the fact that he was in communication with the president at that critical time is the fact that if the department doesn't move forward, it just reinforces a message that Congress no longer has any oversight power. and that certain people are above the law. If you or I or anyone else got a subpoena to show up in court or before Congress and basically just decided not to, we would be arrested. There'd be a bench warrant for us. And a court without the power to compel witnesses is no court. A Congress without the power to compel witnesses' information is no Congress. It becomes merely a plaything in the hands of an autocrat. So I think it's as important as getting Bannon's testimony. It's equally important to restore the rule of law and the idea that nobody is above the law.
So we're waiting to see what Merrick Garland will do with Steve Bannon. As yet, the Attorney General has done nothing vis-a-vis Donald Trump, although some people point out that his call, just the one call to the Secretary of State of Georgia asking him to find 11,780 votes was a clear violation of federal law. Some Democrats, to me, have expressed frustration at the Attorney General for not already appointing a special prosecutor. Do you share that view? And if so, why hasn't he?
I certainly share the view that the former president's conduct should be investigated to determine if crimes have been committed, that we can't have a situation where when you are president, you can't be prosecuted, and when you leave office, you can't be prosecuted, because that really would make the president untouchable. And that's a dangerous prospect in the abstract. It's even more dangerous when you consider that Donald Trump is once again running for president. So I think in particular, and you put your finger on what I think is the most serious allegation that needs investigation, and that's the president's efforts to get the Secretary of State of Georgia to essentially fraudulently create 11,780 votes, just the number he would need to beat Joe Biden in Georgia, because anyone else would have been indicted for that by now. And whether that requires the appointment of a special prosecutor or can be handled by the Department of Justice itself, I haven't really opined on, but I do think that potential crime, the indictment in which individual one is already mentioned in the Southern District of New York. Donald Trump was involved in directing and coordinating a campaign fraud scheme in which Michael Cohen went to jail, and the Justice Department said Michael Cohen should go to jail for his participation in that scheme. So what's the argument that the guy who is directed and is coordinated needs to go to jail, but the guy who did the coordinating and did the directing gets a pass? So I think all of these issues, and if there are more, need to be worked up by the Justice Department, and then the Attorney General can make the decision whether the best interests of the country are prosecuting a former president or not prosecuting him. But we can't simply ignore the crimes and pretend they didn't happen.
So on a related issue that has surfaced this week, Rolling Stone reports, Congressman, that according to some of the organizers of the January 6th insurrection, they were in touch ahead of time with certain members of Congress, Republican members of Congress, Paul Gosar, Marjorie Taylor Greene. If so, what's the punishment, or what should happen to these members of Congress who in effect were helping organize an assault on the Capitol?
Well, first of all, we're investigating all of this. And I think on a very nonpartisan basis, all of us on the committee, Democrats and Republicans, want to get to the bottom of everyone who had a role in that bloody assault on our Capitol. And we are not excluding anyone from that scrutiny, including members of Congress. So, I don't want to prejudge too much what we're going to find, but there are a number of remedies. Of course, whatever we expose can be shared with the Justice Department so they can determine whether people in Congress or out of Congress have committed criminal acts associated with January 6th. Short of that, the Congress has the power to censure members of Congress and to expel them. And so there are a number of remedies that we can take: ethics complaints, censure, expulsion, that Congress acting on its own can undertake. But I think first we need to gather the evidence, see what the strength of that evidence, what the role members may have played before we reach any or jump to any conclusions about what the remedy should be.
That is definitely one of the things that January 6th Select Committee will be looking at.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. And finally, before we get right into the book, in your book, you talk about what an honor it was for you to work with John Lewis on voting rights in the House. Now, with this blockade and this failed attempt to get voting rights through the Senate, in your judgment, Congressman, is it time to either end or fix the filibuster?
Absolutely. I favor ending it. Frankly, I would rather have U.S. policy engage in wide swings depending on who's in the majority than be paralyzed and in a constant state of gridlock. I think gridlock is the absolute worst prescription for democracy. And I also think it's important that a majority of the American people can effectuate their will through the Congress, which is not possible either with a gerrymander in the House or with a filibuster in the Senate. The Senate is already unrepresentative of the country, given that 23% of the population controls 60% of the votes in the Senate. So I favor doing away with it altogether, but at an absolute minimum, the filibuster cannot be used once again to protect a new generation of Jim Crow laws to disenfranchise people of color. And I do think it's going to require the persistent attention of the president, quite personally, with Joe Manchin, to help Joe Manchin find a path to passage of voting rights. And I'm hoping that the efforts to take it up and seeing that it failed last week are part of making the case to Joe Manchin and therefore to the people of West Virginia that there's no way Republicans are going to go along with protecting voting rights, because the Republican business model right now is to disenfranchise people. Mm-hmm. They realize their policies are backward and unpopular, and the only way they can achieve power is if they get fewer people to vote by making it difficult for people to vote. And so this has just got to get done. In my view, it's an existential issue in terms of our democracy.
Bill Press with California Congressman Adam Schiff. If you'd like to hear the entire episode, visit BillPressPods.com. That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Amy Freed, Gaby Goldstein, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.